Hello. I'm going to be talking about changing decimal numbers to tape measure fractions, okay? Or in some cases to the fractions you might have on measuring cups, okay? So the reason for this is a lot of times when you add, subtract, multiply, or divide fractions, you end up with the decimal number because you've changed them to decimals or you're typing them in your calculator, okay? And then you end up with the decimal number and you don't know how to work with it, right? Because it's 0.710 is not on a tape measure, right? Or it's not one of the labels on the measuring cup. So then how do I take that decimal number and change it to a fraction that I then can measure with? I'm going to share my screen here. So a couple things to remember as you're starting out here. We can change from a fraction to a decimal pretty easy, okay, by dividing the top number by the bottom number. Okay? And recall that we also can multiply by a fraction if the top number and the bottom number are the same, okay, if you multiply some number by a fraction that has the same number on top and a bottom, it's the same thing as multiplying by 1 and does not change the value of the number. Okay? So for instance, if I have this fraction, 12 divided by 3, okay, I can rewrite it as a division problem and get the answer 4. Now, I can also multiply it by some fraction that has the same number on top as on bottom. Okay, and essentially, all I'm doing is changing how it looks. I'm rewriting the fraction, okay, because this is still 1, okay, so I'm not changing the value, I'm just rewriting it, and then I can be back to where I started my 12/3. Okay, that will just help kind of understand where we come from a little bit down further if we remember those facts. Okay. All right, so if we start with a decimal, and how do we get to 4ths, 8ths, and 16ths then? Okay, because those are the ones we found in tape measures. Now we'll talk a little bit about thirds, okay, because when we're measuring with measuring cups in the culinary world, sometimes we have that fraction that would be useful to also convert a decimal to. All right, so 0.75 as a decimal. What is that as a fraction? A lot of you might already know that, okay? That's fine. Uh, I've also taught changing decimals to fractions using place value, and we're actually going to start with that, okay? Because that's kind of probably the traditional way to think about it. To change this decimal to a fraction, I look at the digit that is furthest to the right. What place value is it in? And it's in the hundredths place value. Okay, so that means then I can rewrite this fraction, or rewrite this decimal as a fraction by putting it over 100, because it goes to the hundredths place, and then every digit to the right of the decimal place goes on top as my numerator. All right, we can't measure with that though. We don't have a tape on our tape measure. We don't have hundredths. With this one though, it's relatively easy because we can reduce this guy. Okay? If I divide the top and the bottom by 25 both, I end up with 75 divided by 25 gives me 3. 100 divided by 25 gives me 4, 3/4. And we can measure that on a tape measure, so we're good. Okay. All right, now I wanted though to emphasize that there's another way, a little bit shorter way. Okay, perhaps a little bit easier. Okay, so if we recognize this up here, this fact, we can multiply something by a number, okay, a fraction. If the number on top and number on bottom is the same, all we're doing is rewriting the fraction. We're not changing or rewriting the number. We're not changing the value. Okay. So if I were to, instead of 0.75, if I were to multiply this, okay, by 4 over 4, okay, I wouldn't be changing the value. What would happen here? Let's see what would happen. So if I take this, in order to multiply fractions, I like to have two fractions. So I can put this over 1. We've talked about this previously. It doesn't change the value. And then I can end up with a fraction that's going to be over 4, kind of like what I wanted, right? Something I can measure on my tape measure. So what does 0.75 times 4 equal? Well, type in your calculator, and you should get 3. Right. So what we're saying essentially is here, we have this decimal 0.75. And what I'm asking myself is how many fourths, okay, is 0.75? Okay, 0.75 of this, okay, will give us how many fourths we have. All right, let's see if it works on more than one problem. All right, so 0.375. Right now, if we were to go and use place value for this, we could look at this as, well, it goes out to the thousandths place. And we've got 375 of those thousandths. And if we were to divide this, excuse me, might have to do it a couple times here. Let's just do 25 for now. I probably could have done one that's a little bit better, but 375 divided by 25. Okay. Sorry. I should have this. Okay, it's 15. And 1,000 divided by 25 should give us 40. Now we can also divide that to reduce it even further. Okay, divide the top by 5 and the bottom by 5. We end up with 3/8. All right, now let's check to see if that works this other way that we did it here. All right, so 0.375. Let's try this. Instead of doing this method, though, let's do this method. And since we ended up with 8s after we reduced, I'm going to figure out how many 8s 0.0375 is, multiplying it by 8/8. Now I'm not going to put this over 1 this time because I just want you to realize, hey, we're taking the top number times the top, or this number times the top number. The bottom is going to be 1 times 8. So we're going to end up with 8 on the bottom. If you type 0.375 times 8, you will end up with the answer 3. It works. Right. And this method's a little bit quicker than trying to do all this simplifying and reduction, okay? So let's try this here. Let's do 0.0625, and on your calculator, all right, multiply that. Let's do it, I don't know, let's do it on the tape measure. We can measure 8, so let's do 8. What does it give you? Uh-oh, ended up with another decimal. Okay, 0.5. Now don't be tempted to say, oh, that's half of an inch. No, 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 no. Okay, if you get a decimal and you're doing this process, now remember what I actually did is not just multiplied by 8, but I multiplied by 8/8. Okay, I was kind of just making it quicker there with typing it over 8. Okay, so really what this is saying is it's 0.5/8, 0.58, half of an eighth. Well, you might think and know that half of an eighth is a 16th. If you didn't know that, this 0.5 should give you a clue that, hey, you didn't quite go to this smaller enough measurement, okay? We can actually go all the way out to the 16ths on typical tape measure. So instead of multiplying by 8, I'm going to multiply it by 16. Should give me, if I type my calculator, 1/16. So as a word of caution, usually when you have a decimal and you're trying to get a tape measure fraction, you might as well multiply it by 16 because that's typically the most precise measurement a tape measure can go to. And then if by chance you need to reduce or simplify, then you reduce or simplify. For instance, if we multiply this one by 16, okay, we'd get 6/8, and then we could reduce it to 3/8. All right, one last thing. So I'm going to skip some steps again as I get further on. I skip some steps. So I'm going to times this by 16, and that's going to give me the number that I put over 16. So 0.85 times 16 gives me 13.6. Uh-oh, I got a decimal. Okay, and I said can't have that. Well, 16th is typically the most precise we can get on a tape measure. Sometimes you go out to 30 seconds, but most people don't measure in 30 seconds. So as long as you're going to the 16ths and you get a decimal, it's probably okay. What you have to do, though, is then round it. Okay, round it to the nearest 16th. How do we round? Well, little note here. Hint, remember when rounding, if the decimal is 5 or higher, round up to the nearest whole number. If it is below 5, round down. It's not always the case that we want to do sometimes, especially if we're tight on material. We might want to always round down or different situations in the field. But generally speaking, for most applications in the building trades, if you just round using the normal rule, you'll probably be all right. So instead of 13.6, I am going to write that as 14/16 because at 0.66 is higher than 5, I round up. And then I can reduce this to 7/8. Divide the top by 2 and the bottom by 2, and I get 7/8. It's really not that difficult. All you need to do is multiply by the level of precision that you want to go to. So if you want to go to the 16th, you multiply by 16. How would you change the decimal back? How would you change the decimal into a tape measure fraction? Okay. You multiply the decimal by the level of precision. I'll just say by the bottom number. Okay, we'll go real simple here. By the bottom number you want. Okay. So in other words, if I want to know how many 16ths it is, I would multiply by 16. Round and simplify. All right, here's some ones that I want you to practice on. All right, I will mention a couple things. Notice there's a whole number here. Okay, don't worry about changing the whole number, right? If this was inches, we just leave it as 2 inches. So all you got to do is take the decimal part, 0.375, and figure out how many 16ths that is. Okay. Last thing, for those of you that are in culinary, okay, this one, I don't want you to go to the 16ths. I want you to figure out how many thirds that is, because sometimes it's useful to measure in thirds when we're in culinary. So you're going to be multiplying by 3 here. And that concludes my lesson on changing decimals to tape measure fractions or other fractions that would be useful in measuring.